Hello, everybody. You are listening to the Sinister Story Hour, a podcast brought to you by the Western Skies Podcast Network. Here we discuss a new case each week. We talk about crime, cults, conspiracies, and all things sinister. If you enjoy the show, please like, subscribe, and leave us a 5-star review. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at Sinister Story Hour and on Twitter at Sinister Hour. You can also help support the show for as little as 99 cents per month. As always, thank you for listening, and let's jump in.
Hello, folk music fans. Gordon Lightfoot is one of the greatest folk rock artists ever, and now there's a podcast celebrating and discussing his work song by song. It's called Carefree Highway Revisited, and every episode, your host, that's me, Mike Messner, will examine one of Gordon's songs with the help of a special guest. So, if that's your cup of tea, why don't you follow us on Podbean, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or TuneIn? That's Carefree Highway Revisited.
Tonight we are going to talk about an extremely odd and eccentric man, and by odd and eccentric I mean, of course, sinister, Carl Tanzler. Carl was born February 8, 1877 in Dresden, Germany. He was known by a few other names, one of which I thought was really cool, Count Karl von Cosel. Although Carl grew up in Germany, at some point he ended up being in Australia prior to the beginning of World War I. He had traveled there from India with the intention of going on to the South Seas Islands. So he stopped in Australia intending to gather equipment and boats and also to become familiar with the weather and the sea conditions. However, he becomes interested in engineering and electrical work, and he ends up buying property and boats, an organ, and an island in the Pacific. It's like any other day. You go buy an organ and an island. After 10 years, he's still there. So Carl had just begun to build a transocean flyer when the war broke out, and the British military authorities placed him in a concentration camp for safekeeping, along with prisoners of war. At the end of the war, they're not permitted to return to their former residence, so he sets out to find his mom, who he had not spoken with since the beginning of the war. He does end up finding his mom, and he stays with her for 3 years. Finally, she recommends that Carl travel to see his sister in the United States. Somewhere around 1920, Carl gets married to Doris Schaefer, and they have 2 children. And Carl does end up taking his mom's advice, and he sails to the United States. He's later joined there in Florida by his wife and 2 daughters. In 1927, he takes a job working as a radiology technician in the U.S. Marine Hospital in Key West, Florida. And at this time, he's working in the hospital in Key West, Florida, and his family is actually staying in a different location in Florida. They're very much together at this time. They're just living separately due to work circumstances. Carl claimed to be visited throughout his life by a dead ancestor, Countess Anna Constantia van Cosel, which is also an extremely cool name. According to Carl, she would often reveal to him the face of his one true love, who was not his wife, by the way. She was an exotic, dark-haired woman. Now we're going to take a small ad break, and I will return with the rest of our story in just a moment. Hey guys, have you thought about making your own podcast, but you're not really sure where to start? That's how I was at first, and really the only choice that stood out to me was Anchor. And let me tell you why. It was completely free to start, and it has all the tools that allow me to record and edit my podcast right from my phone or computer. And they distribute the podcast for me, so it's heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other platforms. There's no minimum listenership, and you can start making money from day one. And really everything you need to make your podcast is all in one place. I love it, and I know you will too. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Now this brings us to 1930 with Carl working at the Marine Hospital, still as a radiology technician, and he meets a young woman, a local Cuban-American named Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos, who was also referred to by some as Helen. In this episode, we are actually going to refer to her as Elena. Now, immediately upon meeting Elena, Carl recognizes her as the same beautiful dark-haired woman that had been revealed to him all throughout his life in his visions. Elena, a little bit about her. She was the daughter of a local cigar maker, and at the time of her visit to the hospital, she was actually legally married to Luis Mesa, although he had previously abandoned her because he didn't like the fact that she had a miscarriage. He didn't believe that she could probably carry his child, and so he had left her at some point. And Elena had been brought to the hospital by her mother for treatment. Much of Elena's immediate family had died due to tuberculosis, and unfortunately, that was exactly the diagnosis that was given for Elena. Typically, back in that day, the diagnosis of tuberculosis almost always meant that it was going to be fatal. Now, Carl can't have this. He goes out of his way to help Elena and her family, professing his vast medical knowledge. I mean, he is a radiology technician, so of course he can handle this whole tuberculosis thing, right? So he attempts quite a variety of medicines and equipment, showers her with gifts and all kinds of things. Even when she goes home, he's a regular at her house now. He's at her home, he's treating her medically, giving her gifts of jewelry, clothing, regularly professing his love, and there's no evidence that that was ever reciprocated by Elena. Despite all of Carl's efforts, unfortunately, Elena does eventually die of tuberculosis at her parents' home in Key West. Graciously, Carl pays her funeral with the permission of her family. He then orders the construction of an above-ground mausoleum. He would later claim that Elena's spirit would come to him as he would sit by her grave and serenade her with her favorite Spanish song. He also claimed that her spirit told him at some point to take her home with him. And that's exactly what he does. So one evening in April 1933, Carl creeps through the cemetery and takes her body from the mausoleum, carting it through the cemetery on a toy wagon. Once he's got her body home, he attaches her bones together with piano wire and he gives her glass eyes. As her skin continues to decompose, he's got a solution for that. He just replaces it with silk cloth that's soaked in wax, along with plaster of Paris, which apparently there's not anything you can't do with plaster of Paris. He would also gather her hair as it fell out, and he would eventually make a wig for her from her own hair. As her body continued to decompose and get sunken in, he would fill the abdominal and the chest cavity with rags in an effort to keep it full and maintain her original form. He would dress Elena in stockings, jewelry, gloves, and even put makeup on her face, and he would keep her body with him in his bed. As you can imagine, the smell, probably not pleasant at all, right? But Carl's again got a solution. He uses a lot of perfume, disinfectants, and preserving agents to cover up all of the odor. Eventually, Elena's sister hears rumors of Carl sleeping with her sister's body, so she goes to Carl's home and she confronts him. Elena's sister actually sees him dancing with Elena in front of the window at one point. Elena's sister notifies the authorities and Carl is detained. After a psychiatric examination, Carl was found mentally competent to stand trial. He was charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. The problem was that due to the statute of limitations, there's not much they can do, so the case against Carl was subsequently dropped and he was released. After examining Elena's body, it was put on public display at the Dean Lopez Funeral Home where more than 6,800 people would travel to view the corpse. After that, her body was returned to the Key West Cemetery and buried in a secret unmarked grave to prevent anything else from happening to her in the future. Now, really makes me wonder what the public thought of this back then, but according to everything I read, he was just seen as an eccentric man to the public after this case was dropped, and there was just kind of a general feel throughout the community that his actions had been somewhat romantic. Nobody viewed it as being like this guy is off his rocker. They just thought he was a hopeless romantic. It wasn't widely reported at the time. However, two of the doctors that had attended the autopsy of Elena's remains had reported some evidence of necrophilia with the corpse as well. They reported that there was a vaginal tube that had been inserted into the corpse that allowed for intercourse. That report has been argued by both sides, so I'm not sure what to believe really on that, but I'm not going to say that I doubt it. In 1944, Carl moves to Pasco County, Florida, near his wife Doris. She later even goes on to care for Carl in his older years. Carl received his U.S. citizenship officially in 1950 in Tampa, Florida. And don't think that just because Elena and him weren't physically together, that meant his obsession had ended. He actually made a death mask or a plaster likeness to create a life-sized version of Elena. He would go on to live with this life-size version until his death at age 75 in 1952. There are some stories out there that actually report that he was found in the arms of Elena in his bed, but I think that's just trying to make it sound even more romantic. He was actually not. He was found in his living room. And it was also written that Carl eventually had the body switched and that Elena's remains returned to him and that he died with the real body of Elena being in the home with him. I also don't really think that's true. There have also been stories written that would claim that Carl would later confess to having poisoned Elena. Allegedly, a note was found by some workers in his home, and it stated, quote, "She died because I gave this to her mercifully. I mixed the root of wolfsbane with aconite diluted. It was palatable, and my loved one departed this miserable world on October 25th, 1931. Suffer no more, sweet Elena. I have sent you to the angels with my golden elixir." End quote. Now, I don't know what to think about that. I also think that there were so many stories going around. Everybody wanted to have some sort of a story at the time. And I don't know that I believe that as well. Her corpse, since it had been on public display for so long, there are quite a few pictures to be seen. So I'll go ahead and share those to my social media accounts. If you'd like to see that, definitely check them out. And as always, thank you so much for listening to tonight's story. I wish you all so much love, and I wish you all true love, but not the kind of love that Carl had for Elena. Now, as I said last episode, I will be ending each episode with a story of someone who lost their life due to domestic violence. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and this story was taken from my local YWCA Facebook page and hashtag Remember My Story. So tonight we're going to remember 2-year-old Brandon Green. Brandon actually lived in my hometown, and he was killed by his mother's boyfriend / fiance, not sure, but this happened a few years ago here in my hometown. I am going to read this exactly how it was written by Brandon's mother. On May 1st, 2018, my son's life was taken from us by someone that we trusted and loved who turned out to be a monster. Brandon was such a sweet, loving boy. He touched people's hearts that he never met. His little smile could brighten anyone's day. His favorite things were to watch Boss Baby and sing. He loved to play with his cars. McQueen was his favorite. He loved playing tag and playing dress-up with his cousins. His person was his grandma. Of course, he got away with everything. That was Grandma's little man, his partner in crime. Grandma's favorite memory was when he felt left out and we would have to let him dress up with the girls. And when he had to be by Grandma's side, he would always put one leg up on Grandma's leg while watching his favorite movies. One of my favorite memories is when we would go play at McDonald's, he would have to get my attention at the top of the slide. Or when it was bedtime, I would tuck him in. He would always say, "Cuddles, cuddles." I could sit here and write all day because there are so many memories I cherish with him. He gave me the best 2 years of my life that were full of love. I'm so thankful that I have so many pictures and videos to share. They keep him alive. He may be gone from this earth, but he lives on in our hearts forever. So tonight we remember 2-year-old Brandon Green from hashtag Remember My Story. If you have someone that you would like to remember, please send that to me. Email, Twitter, Instagram, whatever the case may be. I would love to share their story as well. So as always, thank you guys for listening, and I will see you next time on Sinister Story Hour.